and after about 15 minutes of baking at 400 degrees, we unwrap the foil, and the English translation of the Bloody Roar Extreme V-Jump interview from shmuplations.com is piping hot and ready to serve. This is a bit different from the other two interviews I did videos on, because in addition to series director Kenji Fukuya, he's joined by Yoshihiko Umakoshi, the supervising animator for Bloody Roar Extreme, or as he's referred to in the interview, the movie character designer, referring to the game's animated cutscenes. This is also a longer interview, so it's going to take a bit of time to cover. I'm sure you don't mind though. Every Bloody Roar game was exclusively on a PlayStation platform until Extreme, when it became a GameCube exclusive. Until it wasn't. And the question is, why make that switch? There's an interview with IGN where Fukuya claimed the GameCube's hardware let them do more in terms of lighting, shading, and graphical fidelity, and he reiterates that here, but with a bit more detail. He says the main memory storage on the GameCube is greater than that on the PS2, and that textures and lighting were easier to work with on the GameCube. He cited the much faster load times for Extreme compared with 3 as another example of how they were making good use of the GameCube's hardware. Look, I am not a tech-savvy person by any stretch of the imagination, so what I'm going to do is just show you this specifications chart, tell you that this column is the PS2 and this column is the GameCube, and let you make your own conclusions. Also, regarding the lighting and shading for the GameCube, I have questions about how well those tools were utilized. Aside from instances where the lighting on the character models doesn't change at all when moving into and out of shadows, the lighting on many levels can be really flat and uninteresting. Compare the aircraft carrier in Extreme to the aircraft carrier in 3. With lesser tools, or at least less knowledge on how to use those tools, it seems like 3 has more contrast, color differentiation, and light and shadow play at work that in some ways makes Extreme's presentation look kinda muted and dull. Fukuya took the GameCube love fest one step further by citing gameplay elements which were now possible. He mentions that switching areas after breaking through a wall was tough to pull off because of memory issues, but it wasn't an issue here. He also took a moment to laugh about how they made it so a ring out on the freeway could lead to characters getting hit by cars, which isn't as cynical as it sounds. There were, however, some limitations. Kenji said the levels for Extreme were originally designed to be much larger with a ton of open space. One can only speculate how that would look, but my reaction to that initially is, oh, bigger stages, that's cool. Immediately followed by, people would abuse the hell out of that to play keep away and win by running the clock out. This is actually something I wanted to talk about in depth for a future video, but for the longest time, a lot of people believed that Extreme was a port of Bloody Roar 3, to the point that trying to go to the Wikipedia page for Extreme would redirect you to Bloody Roar 3's page. If you have eyes and ears, you can tell that they are clearly not the same game. Different level selection, different roster, different soundtrack, different story, different presentation, different character models, etc. So then what is it really, and where does it fall chronologically in relation to the rest of the series? Kenji was both clear and confusing about this, saying that it was both right after 3 and overlapping with it. But he added that it would be more accurate to say he just forgot about 3, saying Extreme is like a parallel world or a different story in the same series. Makes sense since every character's age stays the same between 3 and Extreme. So there you have it. The series director basically stated that Extreme is a spin-off. Here's what I find interesting though. He said that the next Bloody Roar game would be determined by what platform they developed for. If they moved to a different platform, it would be Bloody Roar 4, but if they stayed on the GameCube, it would be a follow-up to Extreme. The funny thing is that they wound up making Bloody Roar 4 for the PlayStation 2, but they just recycled almost everything from Extreme, to the point that Fang, Kronos, and Ganesha are all embedded in the game's code. Too bad damn near everything they changed for 4 was a change for the worse. Maybe somewhere out there is a parallel universe where a follow-up to Extreme was made instead. Unfortunately, Konami is probably shitty in that universe too. At one point, Fukuya states that there were some things in Extreme that didn't completely come out the way he wanted. He then joked with Yoshihiko about making a TV anime for Bloody Roar, something that a number of people have genuinely asked for and been interested in, particularly since there was also a manga adaptation. When asked if he could handle that, Umakoshi's response was, and I quote, "I would die." In fact, when talking about working every character into the intro sequence, he reiterated, quote, "I thought we were gonna die." He said the original designs for the characters had a ton of detail in them, particularly for some of the beast forms. Umakoshi cited things like tiger stripes and leopard spots as being particularly difficult to draw and potentially animate. They had to reduce the amount of detail in the animated characters multiple times to be able to not just make them work, but finish the opening sequence in time for the game's release. This might explain why several characters barely move, or, in Long and Marvel's case, don't move at all in the intro cutscene, or the glaring lack of detail in other animated shots, where the majority of the non-in-game characters tend to look like barely animated potato people, or sometimes not animated at all potato people. It also explains why the vast majority of the roster does not have their beast forms show up at all during cutscenes. Though it doesn't explain why some of the in-game character models and the animated cutscene versions of them tend to look quite different from each other. He added that this was the reason only Yugo transformed at the end of the intro, and why for the transformation they just flubbed it by having a burst of light. I would say, well, that's how it happens in-game anyway, but then I remember that the very first Bloody Roar game showed Yugo's full transformation from human to beast form. It used zoomed-in camera angles to get away with not showing most of the character model in the shot, and I can't help but wonder if doing that for the animated version would have helped avoid the burst of light trick. Also, why does Yugo's transformation look much slower, more painful, and like he's not used to doing the thing he's been doing for 4 games now? As for which characters were the hardest to animate, Umakoshi said he hated animating Yugo, who also happens to be the character who moves around the most during these cutscenes. He originally had a nicer expression, but he came out looking a lot meaner, in part because of the scar on his face, which Umakoshi said they put in a bad place that tends to make him look angry, particularly when he furrows his brow. Apparently Xion was pretty simple to animate, but only because they didn't have to animate his beast form. As for who the easiest character to animate was, have your guesses ready as I tell you the answer in 3, 2, 1, Busuzima. He was a breeze, Umakoshi said. No, I don't know how that works. Kenji did it! He finally got his elephant character, Ganesha. Believe it or not, he credits the GameCube for being able to handle a character of Ganesha's size and properly replicate the elephant skin texture. Fukuya added that he didn't know what kind of elephant he wanted at first, but he knew for sure he wanted this to be an older character. Ultimately, he decided to make the character an Indian man in his mid-50s who becomes an Indian elephant, describing his moveset as the idea of, quote, Indian sumo. Apparently, Indian sumo involves a lot of pro wrestling moves. Kronos was also said to be possible thanks to the GameCube, particularly with his 3 different forms and the dramatic size change for the penguin form. He stated in black and white that Kronos was originally made as a joke in response to the fan poll.
We have purposely trained him wrong, as a joke.
If you've got an ass, I'll kick it!
But as time went on, they started taking him more seriously, and he developed into most characters' final boss. Beyond that though, there were a few things about the new characters that they simply did not plan for. Fukuya said he planned all along for one of the tusks in Ganesha's beast form to be broken. But as for why it's broken, he says he can't talk about it and admits that it was something he came up with so he could attach a backstory to it at a later time. There's also no word on why this seemingly has no effect on his human form. At least cut part of his hair off or something. And then there's the Penguin Papa, King Orion. He never fights, never transforms, and frankly doesn't do much in damn near any of the cutscenes. But Fukuya said they did know what King Orion's beast form was. and that he wouldn't say what it was until the next game. Obviously, that never happened, and based on how he was talking, it isn't clear whether he was being serious or not. Given this game's penchant for mixing in Greek names and creatures, though, King Orion would probably turn into a Pegasus or a Cerberus or something like that. Here is how the flow of questions went leading up to this point. Who did you really hate animating? Who was the easiest to animate? And immediately after that, what was it like creating the female characters? After that somewhat awkward jump in the line of questioning, Korea decided to both not really answer this question for most of the roster, and break down the Bloody Roar ladies from youngest to oldest, starting by calling Uriko young and flighty and immediately moving on to Alice, who he said was younger than the boyish Marvel. Kenji? Marvel is 3 years younger than Alice. Hard drinker from Hokkaido anyway. He then says Jenny is the oldest and has more of a Wait, he actually said this? He said Jenny has a sexy MILF thing going on! So, longtime viewers of this channel, remember every time I brought up how the developers were really blatant and overdoing it with the Jenny fan service? Well, for everyone who said, nah, you're wrong, that's not what they're doing, she's a serious character, you're reading too much into it, I'd like to welcome you to SCXCR's Hometown Buffet, where today's menu has all-you-can-eat servings of your own words. For Alice specifically, he says Extreme was a coming-of-age story of sorts, where she goes from being more youthful and silly to calm and mature to become what he called the best Alice yet, adding that he was the one who was attached to her old pigtailed hairstyle so they could implement this hairstyle, which... Alice's hair is more than just a stylistic choice, or at least it used to be. Early in the Bloody Roar series, character design often involved giving some characters some kind of physical resemblance to their beast forms. This can be seen in Greg's stature, with his huge arms and torso and comparatively smaller looking legs, similar to the physical build of a gorilla. Or in the first Bakuryu's nose and somewhat elongated bald head, reminiscent of the head of a mole. Or Gato seeing how far he can push the boundary between mutton chops and sideburns, representing the mane of a lion. Or Busuzima and his chameleon form. It can also be seen in Alice, particularly with her hair, as the twin ponytails are/were representative of the ears for her rabbit beast form. Alice isn't the only one who had parts of her design muted or removed over the course of the series, but it does speak to the growing disconnect between each character's human and beast forms. I guess what I'm saying is this. Kenji, you should have fought harder for that. I mean, if your problem with the older designs of Alice was that she had a personality, then yes, this is the best Alice yet. A character so lacking in character that even her fighting stance could be mistaken for someone waiting in line for the toilet. Considering this game is supposed to either overlap 3 or happen shortly after 3, her changes were way too dramatic, which goes for Alice and a couple other characters in this game. Aside from the just as baffling decision to have a more realistic but, and let's be brutally honest, also way more stupid looking version of her rabbit beast form, even her alternate costume looks like it was bought from one of those textile websites that sells blank t-shirts in bulk. This Alice resembles Alice so little that some might more accurately call her Aino, Alice in name only, but I think an even more accurate name would be Focus Group Alice, a version of Alice where her most prominent and defining features were toned down in the interest of appealing to more people, but she just came out looking more generic, and her appearance and behavior are so different she might as well be an entirely different person. Personality-wise, Alice before this point had a brighter outlook on things, but still knew when to get serious and throw down, and when that was over, she would care for her opponent if necessary, and her love for Yugo was always stronger than her concerns for him. Here, Alice's intro shot just shows her moping around the beach, although she more so looks kind of bored. And her ending consists of slapping Yugo over possibly getting killed, Alice, it's a fighting tournament and not the Mortal Kombat kind, before shrugging him off and crying. Who are you and where is the real Alice? Kenji ended this question by saying they still really struggled with Alice. You don't say. Remember when Nintendo held an open tournament for ARMS? And the guy who won the tournament went against the game's director, Kosuke Ibuki, and Ibuki wiped the floor with him in an exhibition match? If that were attempted with Bloody Roar Extreme, there's a decent chance that might have happened with Kenji Fukuya, as he was described in the prior V-Jump as a top-tier Bloody Roar player who went under the name Beast King. For Hyper Beast specifically, Fukuya said that it was nerfed slightly and that the changes made to it were with the intent of making strategic play easier, but he worried that they made it too easy to get into Hyper Beast form. For context, while in Bloody Roar 3 you could just do this once per round with a full beast gauge, in Extreme it's possible to get into Hyper Beast form whenever, even with an empty beast gauge, by sacrificing some health, meaning it can be triggered several times in a single round. So yeah, Kenji, it is way too easy to use and subsequently overuse Hyper Beast. He was pretty on point when he said it was possible to practically combo forever with Yugo, and he added that both he and Gato had easy combos. Yes, he's using the word combos instead of strings. Get mad about it, FGC. For gaining an understanding of the game's deeper mechanics, Fukuya recommends playing as Marvel, saying she's well-rounded and doesn't have any weird or overpowered moves. For casual play, he recommends Gato or Yugo, but he doesn't recommend Jenny or Busuzima for beginners. He did say that Busuzima was made stronger for Extreme, but the Lizard Man is still widely regarded as the worst character in the game, so didn't make him strong enough apparently. I hope you're all really excited because it's time to get depressed. For the Hyper Beast system, Fukuya mentioned that he wanted to add more abilities in later entries. In Extreme, there are 17 characters sharing 18 abilities, with everyone's hyper form having 2 abilities. In the future, they did not add more abilities. In fact, they just reverted the Hyper Beast form to something like what Bloody Roar 3 did. But instead of it being timed, it's based on sacrificing all of your human health and really isn't ever worth doing. Then he discussed future characters, and with the benefit of hindsight, Fukuya's answer to the question of what Zoanthrope he'll add next is the equivalent of seeing someone in a horror movie about to get jumped by a serial killer. He mentions the poll, where the #1 fan suggestion for beast forms was a dragon. He mused about what kind of dragon it would be, an Asian dragon, a Western dragon, Godzilla, but then he says, quote, "Maybe they should be the hero of the next game." First of all, I have no idea what kind of dragon this is supposed to be. It looks like someone crossed the dragon from Dragonheart with a couple of F-Zero machines. Kenji was absolutely right about the dragon character being way too strong, as it could dole out tons of damage, largely didn't flinch when it was hit, and took up more than half of the square footage of several claustrophobic stages. It was to the point that when they made it the final boss for arcade runs, they had to empty one of his health bars and make him very likely to drain the rest of his health with his beast drives. To the point this boss usually beats itself by either completely draining its own health or putzing around until the clock runs out, at which point the player, who starts off with 2 full health bars, wins by default. As for the dragon character being the hero, what ended up happening was arguably worse than that. Instead of being a protagonist who saves the day and can be largely ignored outside of his playthrough, they made him the focus of and final boss for every single character, making him completely unavoidable. And then they strapped an annoying yap dog to his hip so she could vomit exposition while the in-game characters pretended to care. Anyway, in retrospect, Fukuya's final words come off as a bit ominous. He's given the floor to say anything to fans of Bloody Roar, and instead of talking more about his desires for future entries or giving some remotely optimistic message, he simply says, quote, "For now, just keep playing until you unlock Fang." Even though he ends with a laugh, this doesn't exactly inspire confidence, and in the worst interpretation can come off as having the tone of,
"Shut up, meet your pine cone."
Beyond this point, Bloody Roar 4 becomes a rushed mess of a game which tanks critically and commercially and drags the series down with it. You know who else was dragged into oblivion with it? Kenji Fukuya. He didn't give interviews leading up to Bloody Roar 4's release. He didn't give interviews after the release, and believe me, I tried finding either of these. There was no V-Jump, so he wasn't interviewed for that. And you know how many games he worked on after Bloody Roar 4? 0. He has no online social media, he has no website, he has no profile or resume on job sites. He's effectively disappeared. To the point that, and I can't tell you where I heard this from, so take it with a grain of salt, his former co-workers didn't know where he went or what he did afterward, and they have no idea where he is now. If he is still somewhere out there, I would tell him I and countless other people appreciate the work he put into these games, and that I hope he's living his best life. As always, the full interview can be found linked in the description. This short series was made possible thanks to the efforts of shmuplations.com, who translate interviews with Japanese game development figures of all sorts about all kinds of games. If you want to support them, they have a Patreon used for helping decide what interviews get translated next at patreon.com/shmuplations. Or you could just ask them questions about crab zoanthropes.
Crab!
What, you thought I wasn't going to do that at least once?